The bank manager said it so casually that I almost missed the danger in it. Mrs. Whitmore, do you want your son to keep controlling the monthly transfers, or would you like to review them yourself again? Again. That was the word that made me stop breathing. I had come in because my electric bill showed as unpaid even though I knew I had sent the payment. At 68 years old, I still paid my own bills. I still balanced my accounts every Friday morning with a cup of tea beside me. I still knew exactly how much money Richard and I had saved before he passed. So when the woman behind the desk said my son was controlling my money, I stared at her as though she had started speaking another language. My son does not control my money. The manager looked down at the screen, then back at me. Then her face changed, not dramatically, carefully. I hated careful faces. "Oh," she said softly. "I'm sorry, I may have misunderstood the account arrangement." "What arrangement?" Her fingers hovered above the keyboard. "There is a family financial assistance authorization attached to your profile." The room became strangely quiet. Behind me, someone at another desk laughed at something ordinary. A printer clicked. The glass doors opened and closed, but I heard only one word: authorization. I never signed that. The manager's expression became more cautious. "It appears it was added 4 months ago." 4 months. That was right after my minor surgery. Nothing serious, a hernia repair. 2 weeks of discomfort, a little medication, and my son Peter coming over to help with errands because he insisted I shouldn't push myself. Peter, my careful son, my responsible son. My son who never forgot a birthday, never raised his voice, and always spoke like he had already considered every possible outcome. "What exactly does this authorization allow?" I asked. The manager swallowed. "It allows your son to manage recurring payments, set transfer limits, approve unusual transactions, and receive account alerts." Receive account alerts. My private financial life had been sending notifications to my son. "How long has he been receiving alerts?" She looked at the screen again. "Since the authorization was added." I sat back slowly. "For 4 months, every bill, every grocery purchase, every donation to church, every birthday gift for my grandchildren, Peter had been able to see it. And I had not known." The manager must have noticed something on my face because she leaned forward gently. "Mrs. Whitmore, sometimes families add support after health events just to make things easier." There it was. Support, the softest word in the world when people are taking pieces of your independence away. I asked him to help me bring groceries inside. Not manage my bank account. Her cheeks colored slightly. "I understand," but she said it in the tone people use when they do not fully understand at all. I asked for printed copies of every authorization, every transfer, every account note. She hesitated before giving them to me, not because she refused. Because somewhere in that system, I had already become a woman who needed someone else involved. When she finally handed me the packet, I saw my signature at the bottom of the first form. Or something close to it, close enough for a rushed employee, wrong enough for a wife who had signed Christmas cards for 46 years. My hand began to shake. The manager noticed immediately. "Would you like me to call your son?" "No," I said it too sharply. Her face softened again. That softening frightened me more than suspicion. "No," I repeated, calmer this time. "I want him removed." She typed for several seconds, then stopped. "I can submit a removal request, but because the authorization is marked as protective assistance, it may need review." "Protective assistance." "Yes, what is it protecting?" She did not answer right away. Then carefully, she said, "The notes mention recent confusion with bill payments." I almost laughed, not because it was funny, because I finally understood the unpaid electric bill. Peter had moved it, or stopped it, or changed the schedule. Then the missed payment became evidence that I was confused. The trap was so neat it made me feel sick. I drove home with the printed packet on the passenger seat, glancing at it at every red light, as though it might disappear. Inside my house, I went straight to the kitchen table and spread the pages out. Recurring transfers I did not recognize. A savings withdrawal marked family reimbursement. A new online banking device linked to my account, Peter's tablet. Then I found the account notes. Client occasionally forgets payment dates. Son assisting with financial organization after surgery. Family concerned about increasing difficulty managing finances independently. I read that sentence 3 times. Family concerned. Which family? Peter had no siblings. Richard was gone. My sister lived 2 states away. Family concerned meant Peter concerned. And Peter concerned had apparently become enough for the bank to start treating my money like it partly belonged under his supervision. At 5 o'clock, he let himself into my house with the spare key. I heard the door open before I saw him. "Mom!" His voice sounded normal. That was what frightened me. He entered the kitchen holding a paper bag from the bakery. Then he saw the bank documents on the table. He stopped. For one long second, neither of us spoke. His eyes moved from the papers to my face. Then he sighed, not with surprise, with disappointment, like a teacher catching a student in a predictable mistake. "You went to the bank." I stood slowly. "You took control of my account." He placed the bakery bag on the counter. "I was helping." "No, Peter, you were watching." His jaw tightened slightly. "You missed payments. You changed them. I reorganized them." I stared at him. "Without telling me. You were recovering from a minor surgery. You were overwhelmed." There it was. The word that turns an adult woman into a problem to manage. Overwhelmed. I pointed to the paper with my signature. "Did I sign this?" Peter looked at it, then away. My chest tightened. "Answer me. You signed several forms after surgery. I was on pain medication. You knew what you were signing." "No, I trusted you to tell me." The sentence hung between us. For the first time, his face changed. Not guilt exactly, something close to discomfort. Then he said quietly, "I didn't think you'd mind once things were easier." Once things were easier. Not if I agreed. Not after we discussed it. Once I accepted the new arrangement he had already made. I sat down because my legs suddenly felt weak. "How much money have you moved?" "Not much." "How much?" He rubbed his forehead. "Mom, please don't make this dramatic." Dramatic. Another word people use when they want your reaction to seem larger than their betrayal. I lowered my voice. "Peter," he exhaled. "A little over 14,000. The kitchen disappeared around me for a moment. $14,000. From my savings, from Richard's pension, from the account I used to feel safe. "For what?" His eyes did not meet mine. "Temporary expenses." "What expenses?" He said nothing. And suddenly I knew this was not about bill payments. Not entirely. This was about something Peter had not told me. Something he had hidden carefully enough to make my supposed confusion useful. Outside, rain began tapping lightly against the kitchen windows. Peter stood in my home, looking tired and cornered. And I realized that the bank manager's question had not exposed the beginning of something. It had exposed something already well underway. Peter finally sat down across from me at the kitchen table. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The rain outside had grown heavier now, tapping steadily against the windows, while the kitchen clock ticked too loudly in the silence. $14,000. I kept staring at the number written on the transfer summary, as though it might rearrange itself into something less terrible if I looked long enough. "What expenses?" I asked again. Peter rubbed both hands over his face. "Claire lost her job in February. Claire, my daughter-in-law, she found another job. Not immediately." "How much money did you need?" He hesitated. That hesitation frightened me instantly. "Peter, we fell behind on the mortgage." Mortgage. The word landed heavily between us. "You took $14,000 from my account because you were behind on your mortgage. It wasn't stealing." "Interesting. Not, I borrowed it. I plan to repay it." Immediately, he defended the morality of it. "You moved my money without permission. You would have helped us if I asked. That isn't the point." "No," he said quietly. "The point is that you weren't handling things well after surgery." There it was again. The justification, not greed, concern, always concern. I stared at my son carefully. "What exactly was I handling well?" "You forgot the gas bill. I paid it 2 days late. You left groceries in the car once. I had stitches and couldn't carry everything inside alone. You seemed confused. Examples. I wanted examples desperately now. Specificity, reality, but fear survives best inside vague language. Peter looked exhausted suddenly. You called me crying at midnight because you couldn't remember your banking password. Richard. Again, the surgery happened only 2 weeks before the anniversary of my husband's death. I barely slept that month. Grief mixed with medication and exhaustion until every day felt slightly blurred. Normal human vulnerability had apparently become evidence. You know what's strange? I whispered. Peter frowned slightly. You remember every mistake I made, perfectly. The room went silent. Because it was true, he had been collecting moments quietly. Late bill, forgotten password, groceries in the car, tiny human errors rearranged carefully into a narrative. I picked up another page from the bank packet. What is family reimbursement? Peter's jaw tightened instantly. Medical expenses. For who? Another silence, too long. Then quietly, Claire, I laughed softly, brokenly, you reimbursed yourself from my retirement account. We needed help. You could have asked. You would have worried. No. He would have felt ashamed. That was the real truth underneath all this. Asking would have forced him to see himself taking money from his widowed mother. Control made it easier. Because if I became a woman who needed supervision, then he became a responsible son instead of a desperate man, moving his mother's savings quietly into his own account. I suddenly felt unbearably tired. Not angry anymore, just tired. Tired of careful language, tired of soft justifications. Tired of being transformed into a fragile version of myself I did not recognize. Then Peter said something that hollowed me completely. The bank advisor actually thought it was a good idea. The room went cold. What? She said older clients often do better with family oversight after medical events. Oversight. Another harmless word quietly rearranging power. I stared at him. So you told the bank I couldn't manage my own money. I said you needed support. Support, always support, never control. Never surveillance. Support. I looked down at the paperwork again. Then another detail caught my attention. Unusual purchase monitoring enabled. What is this? Peter shifted uncomfortably. It sends alerts if spending changes suddenly. My chest tightened instantly. You monitored my purchases. It was just precautionary. Precautionary. Fear wrapped in administrative language. What counted as unusual? Peter hesitated. Large withdrawals, donations, travel spending. Travel spending, I blinked. You flagged my own spending as suspicious. It was automatic. No. Not automatic. Chosen. Every system begins with a human decision somewhere. I stood slowly and walked toward the sink because suddenly the kitchen felt too small. The idea that my son had been receiving alerts every time I used my own money made me feel physically ill. Then another memory surfaced. 3 months earlier, Peter casually asking, "Why did you withdraw $800 last week?" At the time, I assumed the bank contacted him accidentally because he helped me set up online banking years earlier. God help me, he had been monitoring me already. I turned back toward him slowly. How long were you planning to keep this hidden? Peter's shoulders slumped slightly. I thought eventually you'd appreciate the help. The help, I almost laughed again. Do you know what the cruelest part is? He remained silent. For months, I thought I was becoming forgetful. The room stayed completely still. I pointed toward the paperwork. You changed payment dates, moved transfers, reorganized my accounts. I felt tears burning behind my eyes now. Then every time something looked unfamiliar, I blamed myself. Peter looked genuinely shaken for the first time, not defensive. Not careful, ashamed. I never wanted you doubting yourself. No, I whispered. You just wanted me dependent enough not to question you. The sentence hit him hard. I saw it immediately in his face, because somewhere deep down he knew, not consciously perhaps, but enough. Enough to avoid telling me, enough to hide transfers. Enough to let the bank believe I needed supervision. Then quietly, almost desperately, he said, I was scared. There it was, finally, not organization, not support, fear. I sat back down slowly. Of what? His eyes filled suddenly. Losing the house, losing everything. The mortgage again, debt, pressure. Fear had carried him somewhere terrible, one careful step at a time. And perhaps the worst part was this. He had convinced himself he was protecting his family while slowly teaching the bank to trust his judgment over mine. Peter stayed at the kitchen table long after the rain stopped. Neither of us touched the pastries he brought from the bakery. The paper bag sat unopened near the coffee maker like something forgotten from another life. Finally, I asked quietly, "How bad is it?" Peter stared down at his hands. "Bad, that isn't a number," he exhaled slowly. "We're almost 6 months behind." 6 months, my stomach tightened painfully. How? Claire's job ended, the hospital bills piled up. Interest kept growing. Hospital bills? What hospital bills? He looked surprised. "You didn't know?" "No, of course I didn't." Because apparently everyone had been protecting me lately by hiding reality from me while quietly reorganizing my life around their fear. Peter rubbed his forehead again. "Claire had surgery in March." I stared at him. "You never told me." "We didn't want to stress me. Another harmless phrase used to justify secrecy. "What surgery?" He hesitated. Then quietly, "An ovarian tumor." The room went completely still, not because I was confused, because suddenly everything rearranged itself emotionally. Fear, debt, desperation. Peter looked smaller sitting there now. Not manipulative, not strategic, terrified. Terrified of losing his wife, terrified of losing his home, terrified of failing his children. And somewhere along the way, fear had convinced him that controlling his mother's money sounded more responsible than asking for help honestly. I sat down slowly again. "Was it cancer?" "No," relief moved through me so sharply it almost hurt. "She's okay now. She's recovering." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then I asked softly, "So why not tell me the truth?" Peter laughed once bitterly. "Because I already felt like a failure." There it was, the real wound underneath everything. Shame, not greed. Shame powerful enough to make honesty feel impossible. "I couldn't sit across from you asking for money after spending my entire life trying to prove I could take care of my own family." I understood that. God help me, I understood that completely. That was what made this so painful. If he were cruel, anger would have been easier. Instead, he was frightened and ashamed and drowning quietly enough to start convincing himself that manipulation counted as protection. Then he said something that chilled me instantly. "The bank advisor suggested family monitoring after I explained things." The room went silent. "Explained what?" "That you seemed more forgetful since surgery." Forgetful, again. One word repeated often enough becomes infrastructure. "What exactly did you tell them?" Peter looked exhausted now. "That you were struggling with bills, that you seemed overwhelmed." Overwhelmed. Always overwhelmed. Never grieving, never recovering, just overwhelmed enough to justify supervision. And they simply believed you. They said it's common after medical procedures. Common. That word frightened me more than anything else, because it meant this was not unusual, not exceptional. Systems were already built expecting older adults to slowly surrender financial control after vulnerability. I folded my hands tightly together. "Did anyone at the bank ever ask to speak to me directly?" Peter hesitated. Too long. Then, "They trusted family reporting." Family reporting, interesting phrase, not evidence, not proof. Reporting, I suddenly realized something horrifying. The bank had never actually seen me incapable of anything. They only saw concern repeated consistently enough by my son. Concern becomes credibility very quickly when attached to aging. Then another memory surfaced suddenly. 2 months earlier, the bank freezing my debit card temporarily after I withdrew cash for Susan's birthday trip. At the time, I thought it was fraud protection. Now my chest tightened. "You flagged my account before." Peter looked away instantly. "What did you do?" "I only marked large withdrawals for review." Review. Again that soft administrative language. "You monitored my spending." "It was precautionary." Precautionary. Fear wrapped in procedure. I stared at him. "Do you understand what this feels like?" He said nothing. For months, every time something strange happened with my account, I thought maybe I was becoming confused. My voice cracked slightly now. The late bill, the frozen debit card. The transfer changes. I looked down at the paperwork spread across the table. You reorganized my finances quietly enough that I started doubting my own memory. Peter covered his face briefly. I never meant that. No, I believed him. That was the tragedy. No one begins these situations planning to destroy trust. They begin by trying to solve problems quietly. Then systems and fear start reinforcing each other, one careful decision at a time. The next morning, I drove back to the bank. This time I asked specifically for the regional branch director. Not because I wanted drama, because suddenly I needed someone to explain how this happened at all. His name was Martin Hale, mid-60s, gray suit, careful eyes. The moment he reviewed the account notes, his expression shifted slightly. Not shock, recognition, that frightened me instantly. You've seen situations like this before. He paused. Yes, the honesty almost relieved me. How often? He leaned back slowly. Family financial assistance arrangements become more common after health events involving older clients. Health events. I almost laughed. A routine surgery had quietly transformed me into an older client, requiring oversight. Did anyone verify whether I actually needed assistance? Martin hesitated. Your son appeared credible and informed. Credible, there was that word again, not correct, not truthful, credible. And I wasn't consulted. The authorization form was signed while I was medicated after surgery. The room went completely silent. Martin folded his hands carefully. That complicates matters. Complicates. Interesting word for unauthorized financial control. I lowered my voice. Do you know what scares me most? He remained silent. You all trusted concern more than reality. The room stayed still. Because it was true. No one saw me incapable. No one tested my understanding. No one watched me fail financially. They simply heard my son say he was worried. And somehow, little by little, that worry became stronger inside the system than my own voice. Martin Hale remained quiet for a long moment after I said that. Then he sighed heavily and removed his glasses. Mrs. Whitmore, institutions are trained to respond aggressively to potential elder financial risk. Potential. That was the word that mattered most. Not proven risk, not demonstrated incapacity. Potential, fear of what might happen someday quietly reshaping what happens now. I sat very still. So your solution is to trust whoever sounds concerned first. His expression tightened slightly. That's not entirely fair. No, I whispered, it's exactly fair. The room stayed silent, because deep down he knew it too. Banks feared exploitation lawsuits, families feared regret. Everyone feared waiting too long. And older adults became trapped in the middle of that fear. Martin folded his hands carefully. The systems are designed to err on the side of caution. Caution. Another beautiful word capable of enormous harm. I looked directly at him. Do you know what your caution did to me? He did not answer. For 4 months, I believed I was becoming forgetful. My voice sounded strangely calm now. Every late payment, every transfer problem, every account alert. I pointed toward the paperwork. My son created confusion inside my finances quietly enough that I blamed myself instead of him. Martin looked genuinely uncomfortable now, not defensive, human. That should not have happened. No, it should not have, yet somehow it had. Because systems built around protecting older adults often become frighteningly comfortable reducing their authority first and asking questions later. Then Martin admitted something that chilled me completely. The account notes suggest the arrangement may have been upgraded recently. Upgraded. My chest tightened instantly. What does that mean? He turned the monitor slightly toward himself. Your son requested expanded monitoring authority last month. The room went cold. Expanded. What authority? Spending notifications, withdrawal verification, large transaction approval. Approval, I stared at him. My son needed to approve my own withdrawals, only above certain limits. Limits, God help me. What limits? $5,000. I almost laughed, not because it was funny. Because suddenly I realized how close this had come to becoming something far worse. One more conversation, one more worried note, one more vulnerable moment. And eventually, I might have needed permission to access my own money entirely. Martin spoke carefully. The request had not yet been finalized. Had not yet. Meaning it was already moving through the system. Momentum. That was the terrifying part. Once institutions begin organizing around possible decline, momentum builds quietly. I suddenly remembered something strange from weeks earlier. Peter casually asking whether I still planned to take Susan to Charleston for her birthday trip. At the time, it seemed like normal conversation. Now my stomach turned cold. The trip would have required a withdrawal larger than $5,000. Peter already knew. Because he monitored the account, and perhaps he was waiting to see whether the bank would flag me trying to spend unusually. I stared down at the table. Then quietly asked, what exactly would have happened if I tried withdrawing more than $5,000? Martin hesitated. The system would have alerted your son automatically. And if he objected, long silence, too long, further review may have been required. Further review. Administrative language hiding something horrifying. I sat back slowly. My own retirement savings had nearly become conditional, not because I was incompetent. Because my son sounded worried enough consistently enough, Martin finally spoke softly. You need to understand that elder financial exploitation cases are rising rapidly. Exploitation. Interesting word considering my own money had been moved without real consent. Do you know what's strange? I asked quietly. What? The system became more suspicious of me than of the person actually taking my money. That sentence landed hard. I saw it immediately in his face. Because somewhere deep down, he understood exactly how true it was. The next afternoon, Claire came to see me alone. I had not spoken to her directly since learning about the mortgage problems. When she entered the house, she looked exhausted. Smaller somehow, not manipulative, not strategic, ashamed. I didn't know how much he moved at first, she whispered immediately. Interesting. Not denial, confession. I motioned for her to sit. How much did you know? He told me you wanted him helping after surgery. Wanted. The lie sounded so soft and believable. I trusted him. Of course she did. He was her husband. Fear had trapped her inside the same story too. Claire stared down at her hands. When the mortgage notices started coming, her voice shook slightly. We were drowning. Drowning, not stealing, not manipulating, drowning. I understood that feeling more than I wanted to admit. After Richard died, there were nights I sat awake terrified of handling life alone. Fear changes people quietly. Claire wiped at her eyes. Peter kept saying it was temporary. Temporary. Another dangerous word. Temporary actions become permanent systems frighteningly fast. He said once things stabilized, he'd move everything back before you noticed. Before I noticed. Not before he asked forgiveness. Not before we discussed it honestly. Before I noticed. The sentence hurt more than I expected, because suddenly I understood the full shape of the betrayal. My son had not only hidden financial control from me, he had built the entire plan around my not realizing it existed. Claire looked around the kitchen quietly. Then softly admitted something that hollowed me completely. He started checking your purchases every night. The room went still. What? He said he needed to watch for unusual spending so the bank wouldn't worry. Unusual spending. I closed my eyes briefly. My life had become monitored behavior. Groceries, travel. Cash withdrawals, all quietly evaluated through the lens of possible decline. Claire's voice cracked suddenly. He convinced himself he was protecting everyone. And that was the tragedy, not greed. Fear mixed with shame until surveillance started sounding responsible. I looked toward the rain-darkened kitchen window, then asked the question haunting me since this began. When exactly did Peter stop seeing me as his mother and start seeing me as financial risk? Claire began crying immediately. Real crying, devastated crying. Because finally someone had spoken the truth aloud. That was the real damage underneath everything, not the missing money, recognition. My son slowly stopped trusting my understanding of my own life more than he trusted his fear of losing control. For the next several days, I barely slept, not because of the missing money anymore, because I kept replaying every interaction from the past 4 months through entirely different eyes. Peter asking casually where I was going before weekend trips. Peter noticing unusual purchases immediately. Peter calling whenever bills looked late. At the time, I thought he was attentive. Now I understood he had been monitoring me constantly. The realization made my own home feel unfamiliar somehow. Every bank notification, every purchase, every transfer, observed. One afternoon, while sorting through the paperwork again, I found another detail buried near the bottom of the account notes. Client may become defensive regarding financial support discussions. Defensive, the word sat on the page like a trap waiting for me, not protective, not independent, defensive. Meaning objection itself had already been reframed as suspicious before I even knew the conversations existed. I suddenly understood something terrifying. Once systems begin quietly documenting older adults through the lens of possible decline, every emotional reaction starts working against them automatically. If I became angry, emotional instability. If I resisted, defensiveness. If I stayed calm, possible masking. There was no safe way to remain fully credible anymore. That evening, Susan came over carrying Chinese takeout neither of us touched. The moment she saw the banknotes spread across the table, her expression darkened instantly. "They wrote this about you," I nodded silently. She read the sentence again, then laughed once bitterly. "So now wanting control over your own money counts as suspicious behavior." Exactly. I sat quietly staring at the notes. For months, I started questioning myself. Susan looked up immediately. "What do you mean?" Every time something looked wrong in the account, I wondered whether I forgot something. There it was again. The real damage, not missing funds, self-doubt. Fear spreads inward eventually. Once enough people treat older adults like unreliable narrators of their own lives, the older adults begin second-guessing themselves too. Susan sat down heavily across from me. "You know what scares me most?" "What?" How easy this all sounded while it was happening. Exactly. Financial assistance, protective oversight, family monitoring. Every phrase sounded responsible. That was what made situations like this so dangerous. Control wrapped in concern becomes difficult to challenge without sounding irrational. The following morning, Peter called repeatedly. I ignored every call, not to punish him, because I no longer trusted myself to separate his fear from my own emotions yet. By afternoon, he appeared at the house anyway. The moment I opened the door, I barely recognized him. Not physically, emotionally, he looked exhausted, smaller somehow. Like someone carrying shame too heavy to hide anymore. "I talked to the bank," he said quietly. I stepped aside without answering. He entered the kitchen slowly, eyes immediately landing on the paperwork still covering the table. Then he saw the account notes. Client may become defensive. His face drained instantly. "They wrote that. You helped them." Peter sat down heavily. For a moment he simply stared at the papers in silence, then quietly whispered, "I didn't realize how far this had gone." Gone. Interesting word. As though momentum itself had carried things beyond intention. I sat across from him. "That's because you stopped seeing me clearly." His eyes filled immediately, not anger. Not defensiveness, recognition, real recognition. "I thought I was protecting you." "No," I whispered softly. "You were protecting yourself from fear." The room went completely still. Because finally we reached the truth underneath everything. Not greed, not malice. Fear, fear of debt, fear of failure, fear of losing control. Fear of becoming the kind of man who needed his widowed mother's savings to survive. Peter covered his face briefly. "I kept telling myself I'd fix it before you noticed." There it was again. Not before asking forgiveness. Not before explaining honestly. Before I noticed. Because somewhere deep down, he already knew what he was doing would hurt me. Then he quietly admitted something that hollowed me completely. "The first time the bank froze your debit card," his voice shook slightly, I approved it. My chest tightened instantly. What? They flagged the Charleston withdrawal automatically. Susan's birthday trip. Of course, Peter looked sick now. I thought if I questioned it, the bank would see me as responsible. Responsible, not controlling, not invasive, responsible. I stared at him in disbelief. You approved freezing my card while I stood at a hotel desk thinking I forgot my own PIN. Peter closed his eyes. I know. No, I do not think he truly understood that moment, the humiliation. The fear, the instant self-doubt, standing in public wondering whether your mind is failing while your own son quietly confirms institutional suspicion behind the scenes. I folded my hands tightly together because suddenly they would not stop shaking. For months, you let me believe I was becoming confused. Peter looked up immediately. No, yes. The room stayed completely silent. You rearranged my financial reality quietly enough that I blamed myself instead of you. His face crumpled then, not careful anymore, not strategic. Devastated, and somehow that hurt worst of all, because I could finally see clearly that my son never intended to destroy my trust in myself. He simply became so frightened of losing control of his own collapsing life that he stopped noticing how much control he was taking from mine. Later that evening, after Peter left, I sat alone in the kitchen long after dark. The house felt painfully quiet. Richard's old clock ticked softly near the hallway. Rain tapped lightly against the windows again. Normal sounds. Yet nothing inside me felt normal anymore. I opened my banking app slowly. For the first time in months, no secondary device appeared connected to the account. No alerts, no monitoring permissions, no spending reviews, just my account, my name, my money, my decisions. Such ordinary things. Yet I stared at the screen for nearly 10 full minutes, because I finally understood how fragile ordinary autonomy becomes once enough people start treating older adults like future problems instead of present human beings. And perhaps that is the cruelest thing fear does inside families. Sometimes people become so terrified of watching you lose control someday, they slowly begin taking pieces of it away long before you are actually gone. The bank restored full control of my accounts the following Tuesday. Martin Hale personally called to confirm the changes. No more financial oversight notes. No more purchase monitoring. No more secondary approvals. Everything sounded clean and resolved on paper. Emotionally, nothing felt resolved at all, because systems can remove restrictions faster than families can rebuild trust. The first strange thing happened 3 days later. I stood inside the grocery store, staring at 2 brands of coffee filters, when my phone buzzed in my purse. For one horrible second, panic flashed through me automatically. Not because anything happened, because my body still expected someone else to be watching my spending. I actually froze there in the aisle, then slowly pulled out the phone. It was only Susan sending me a photograph of her new garden bench. Normal, harmless, yet my hands still shook afterward. That was the damage nobody talks about. Once older adults become monitored long enough, freedom itself starts feeling unfamiliar again. The following Sunday, Peter came over to return the spare house key. He held it awkwardly in his palm while standing near the front door. I think you should keep this back. Back, interesting word. Not because he physically returned a key, because somewhere deep down, he finally understood he had crossed a line from helping into managing. I took the key quietly. Neither of us knew what to say afterward. Then finally Peter whispered, I keep replaying everything. So did I. The debit card freeze, the account alerts, the missing money. But most of all, the self-doubt. I looked at him carefully. Do you know what hurt me most? His eyes lowered immediately. Not the money. The room stayed silent. You made me question myself. Peter closed his eyes briefly. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I think he truly understood. Not intellectually, emotionally. Because financial betrayal heals differently when it is wrapped inside concern. If a stranger steals your money, you stay angry. When your child does it while insisting they are protecting you, part of the wound becomes confusion. The next morning, Claire called asking whether she could visit alone. When she arrived, she carried a thick envelope. Inside was every transfer Peter moved from my account. Dates, amounts, repayment plans. Claire looked exhausted sitting at my kitchen table. "We refinanced the house." I stared at her. "You didn't have to tell me that." "Yes," she whispered. "I think I do." The shame in her voice nearly broke my heart. Because Claire had become trapped inside Peter's fear too, not maliciously, not strategically. Gradually, one compromise at a time. "We'll repay every dollar," she said quietly. I believed her. That was never truly the issue. Money returns through payments and paperwork. Trust returns through tiny moments stretched across years, and sometimes it never fully returns at all. Then Claire admitted something that chilled me completely. The bank advisor told Peter he was doing the responsible thing. Responsible. That word again. I leaned back slowly. What exactly did they say? That families who act early usually prevent bigger financial problems later. Later, always later, the future again. Fear survives comfortably inside future possibilities because no one can prove them wrong yet. Claire twisted her wedding ring nervously. "Peter started believing if he questioned your decisions, it meant he cared." The sentence sat heavily between us, because that was the real danger underneath everything. Once fear becomes morally associated with vigilance, surveillance starts feeling loving. A week later, I received a handwritten apology letter from Martin Hale. Not legal language. Not corporate language. Personal language. He admitted the bank relied too heavily on family concern without verifying actual incapacity. He admitted older clients often lose financial authority gradually through protective systems designed with good intentions. And near the end, he wrote something that stayed with me permanently. "Fear creates procedural momentum faster than institutions realize." Procedural momentum. Such cold words for something that nearly dismantled my confidence in my own mind. That evening, I drove to the Charleston coast alone. Not because I needed the trip, because I needed to spend money freely without anyone monitoring whether it looked suspicious. I booked a hotel overlooking the water, ordered expensive seafood, bought Susan ridiculous souvenirs she did not need. Every purchase felt strangely emotional, not reckless, liberating. The second night there, while paying for dinner, my card declined briefly because the machine lost connection. For one terrible instant, my stomach dropped. Heat rushed through my chest. My thoughts spiraled immediately. Did the bank freeze it again? Did Peter receive an alert? Did I forget something? Then the waitress smiled apologetically. "Sorry, the machine does that sometimes." Sometimes. Normal human error, nothing more. I nearly cried right there at the restaurant table from relief. Because suddenly, I realized how deeply fear had embedded itself inside me. One technical delay and my mind instantly jumped back toward surveillance and self-doubt. That was the true aftermath of losing autonomy temporarily. Even after freedom returns, your nervous system still remembers being watched. When I came home 2 days later, Peter was waiting on my porch, not because he tracked the trip anymore, because Susan told him when I returned. That distinction mattered deeply. He stood when he saw me carrying shopping bags. For a brief second, something passed across his face automatically. Calculation. How much did she spend? Where did she go? Then immediately shame followed behind it, because he noticed himself doing it. I noticed too. Neither of us spoke about it. Instead, Peter quietly carried my bags inside. No questions, no monitoring. No careful concern. Just my son helping his mother carry groceries again. In the kitchen, while unpacking souvenirs, I accidentally dropped a receipt onto the floor. Peter bent to pick it up automatically. For one split second, both of us froze, because we both remembered. The old version of him might have scanned the amount unconsciously, categorized it, evaluated whether it seemed normal. Now he simply handed it back without looking. Such a tiny moment. Yet it nearly made me cry, because trust does not return through speeches. It returns through microscopic choices repeated consistently over time. Later that night, after Peter left, I sat alone at the kitchen table balancing my checkbook for the first time in months. Not because I needed to, because I wanted to. Richard used to tease me for still writing things down by hand even after online banking became popular. But the ritual comforted me. Numbers, receipts. Control, mine. I finished balancing the account perfectly. No confusion, no forgotten payments, no oversight required. Then I looked around the quiet kitchen and understood something that frightened me deeply. The most dangerous part of growing older is not forgetting things. It is how quickly other people can begin interpreting your ordinary humanity as evidence that you are slowly becoming incapable of owning your own life. And sometimes, by the time you realize they have started treating you differently, they have already built systems around the assumption that your voice matters a little less than their fear does.